Have you ever wondered who today's Greeks really are? When we think of Greece, images of Socrates, Pericles, or Homer immediately appear in our minds. Proud figures who shaped the cradle of European culture. But how does this idealized image fit the Greeks we meet today on the streets of Athens, Thessaloniki, or Crete? Are they truly the direct descendants of those heroes of antiquity? Or has history, with all its wars, conquests, and migrations, brought forth something entirely new? Especially in modern times, and particularly since the financial crisis of 2010, this question has resurfaced with new sharpness. Across Europe, people fiercely debated whether Greece even belonged in the European Union. Some even spoke of it as a foreign body, and as if that were not enough, voices arose claiming that modern Greeks were no longer real Greeks at all. They were said to be much more a mixture of Slavs, Byzantines, Albanians, and Turks, a mosaic that had little in common with antiquity. But is that really true? Or does this provocative claim conceal a much deeper truth, namely that identity lies not only in blood, but in language, culture, and shared consciousness? This video takes you on a journey from antiquity to the present day, from the myths surrounding Helen and Achaia through the Slavic incursions to the conflicts of the 19th century when Europe rediscovered its romantic image of Hellas. We will find out what modern genetic research tells us about the continuity of the population, how language and religion proved to be the strongest pillars of identity, and why Greece, despite all mixture and change, is still regarded as the land of the wise. At the same time, we will take a look at the misunderstandings that still shape our image of the Greeks today. Why were their heroes imagined as blonde, although the reality was Mediterranean? Why did many Western Europeans of the 19th century return disappointed from their journey to Greece? And why do the Greeks themselves feel that they are at once heirs of Rome, Byzantium, and antiquity? So stay with us until the very end, because the history of the Greeks is not only a story of the past, it is a mirror of Europe itself, full of ruptures, full of mixtures, full of questions about identity and belonging. And perhaps, in the process, you may also discover part of an answer to the question of who we Europeans really are. When, in the spring of 2010, then Prime Minister George Papandreou stepped before the cameras and asked for financial assistance from Greece's European partners, this was not only the beginning of a long economic ordeal, but also the start of a new debate about the self-understanding of an entire country. Greece, the land of philosophers and myths, suddenly became the symbol of a debt crisis, and the question of whether it even fit into the European Union was suddenly on the table. In Germany and other northern countries, people often spoke in those days of lazy Greeks who had allegedly lived beyond their means, while in Athens demonstrators took to the streets with banners blaming austerity dictates from Brussels and Berlin for the country's social decline. Yet behind the heated debate over numbers, deficits, and loan programs lay a deeper issue. Who are the Greeks, really? Are they, as classical education across Europe had taught for centuries, the proud descendants of Homer, Pericles, and Socrates? Or are they, as some provocative voices claimed, long since a completely different population, shaped by centuries of wars, conquests, and mixing? These questions were by no means new. As early as the 19th century, many Western European travelers returned disappointed from Greece because they did not find the noble descendants of antiquity there, but rather people with dark hair, sun-tanned skin, and customs that seemed foreign, people who did not fit at all with the classical statues of white marble. It was precisely during the financial crisis that publicists revived these old stereotypes. The journalist Berthold Seewald, for example, wrote that even the Battle of Navarino in 1827, when British, French, and Russian ships destroyed the Ottoman fleet and thereby decisively supported the Greek struggle for freedom, had actually been based on a misunderstanding. Europe, he argued, had acted out of pure romanticism, out of the belief that modern Greeks were the direct descendants of the heroes of Marathon and Thermopylae. In reality, according to Seewald, one was already dealing back then with a mixture of Slavs, Byzantines, Albanians, and Turks. This view is exaggerated, but it illustrates how closely economic and cultural doubts are intertwined. Of course, such claims are dangerous, because they suggest that identity can be derived exclusively from genetics. History, however, shows us a far more complex picture. Peoples change, absorb new elements, lose old ones, and yet remain themselves in their self-understanding. That is precisely where the exciting question lies. Is a Greek because he carries certain genes, or because he is part of a cultural and linguistic tradition that has survived for millennia? If we compare, we recognize similar debates in other European countries as well. In Germany, for example, people still discuss to what extent modern Germans are the direct descendants of the Germanic tribes, or whether they are much more a mosaic of Germanic peoples, Celts, Slavs, and Romans. And yet no one doubts that there is a German identity defined through language, culture, and shared history. Greece's modern crisis thus makes it clear that economic problems quickly raise questions of cultural belonging. While Brussels negotiated deficits, the European public debated the dignity of the Greeks, their alleged foreignness, or their closeness to Europe. This debate was hurtful, but it also showed how powerful myths are. Because, if we are honest, the outrage would never have been so great if there had not been the centuries-old idea that Greece was the cradle of European civilization. This is exactly where our journey begins. To understand the doubts and questions of the present, we must go back into the past, to the first names the Greeks gave themselves and to the designations other peoples found for them. For language, names and terms are the key by which we can understand both the continuity and the transformations of Greek identity. When we dive into the history of Greece, we quickly see that there is not only a continuity of people, but also an astonishing variety of names by which the Greeks referred to themselves over the centuries and by which others referred to them. Names are not mere labels. They are mirrors of self-understanding and expressions of a particular age. Anyone who wants to understand the Greeks must therefore first pay attention to the names with which they described themselves. In Homer's Iliad we encounter the earliest names, Argives, Danaans, and Achaeans. These names point to tribes and kings, to the Argive ruler Agamemnon and his followers, who in mythical memory marched against Troy. They show us a world in which identity was still local, tribal, and shaped by myth. Only later did the term Hellenes appear, after Hellen, the mythical forefather of the Aeolians, Dorians, and Ionians. At the latest, by the time of the battles of Thermopylae in the 5th century BC, the Greeks understood themselves as a people of Hellenes, even if internal fragmentation into city-states and dialects repeatedly relativized that unity. But names changed with history. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, the word Hellene suddenly acquired a new disparaging meaning. It referred to pagans, those who held fast to the old gods. In an age when religious identity had become more important than ethnic belonging, it was almost impossible to continue proudly calling oneself a Hellene, without at the same time being branded an unbeliever. In its place, a new term appeared, Romoi. Originally, it referred to the inhabitants of Rome. But with the expansion and transformation of the empire, it became the collective name for all subjects of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Greeks, too, now called themselves Romans, though in a Byzantine sense. This name shows how much identity can change without people surrendering their inner self. For the Greeks no longer saw themselves as pagans, but as part of a Christian civilization that claimed to carry forward the heritage of the Roman Empire. The comparison with other European peoples is interesting here. While the Germanic peoples in the West understood themselves in the early Middle Ages as Franks, Goths, or Saxons, that is, with clearly tribal names, the Greeks bore an imperial title that emphasized their belonging to a universal empire. And while in Germany the self-designation German only gradually took shape in the High Middle Ages, the Greeks had already been calling themselves Romoi for centuries, a name that remained alive in songs, poetry, and everyday culture well into the 20th century. External designations tell a different story. The Romans called the Greeks Greci, a word that in turn went back to the Boeotian tribe of the Graecoi. From this Latin term derived the German Griechen, the English Greeks, and the French Greeks. So while the Greeks called themselves Hellenes or Romoi, others always saw them as Graikoi. This small detail still makes clear how greatly self-perception and external perception can diverge. Particularly poetic is the Georgian term for the Greeks, Berdzini, meaning the wise. This name, which survives in the Georgian language to this day, does not refer to blood or power, but to intellectual greatness. It reminds us that identity is often not determined by genetics or political structures, but by the cultural achievement a people represents in the eyes of others. So we see that names are like mirrors that show us not only how the Greeks understood themselves, but also how others saw them. From the mythical Hellenes to the Christian Romaioi and finally to the European Greeks, an arc stretches across more than 2 millennia. Each of these names tells of ruptures and new beginnings, of religious upheavals and political transformations. And yet the question remains, if the Greeks were once called Hellenes, then Romoi, and finally Greeks, what does that mean for their outward appearance and for the image others formed of them? When we imagine the Greeks of antiquity, many of us still see images that have less to do with reality than with idealized statues of white marble. This idea is no coincidence. Already in the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars and artists painted a picture of the Greeks shaped by harmony, beauty, and classical purity. But what lies behind this idealized image, and what did the people of ancient Hellas actually look like? The sources paint a differentiated picture. Homer, the poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, did indeed mention heroes with shining hair, but this should not be understood literally. In ancient thinking, blonde was regarded as the color of fertility, grain, and life. It was therefore natural to describe gods or heroes in this way. Archaeological investigations of Roman copies of Greek statues, such as the famous Aphrodite of Knidos, have revealed traces of pigment that do indeed suggest blonde hair. But that does not mean the majority of the population looked that way. Rather, the Mediterranean type, with dark hair, brown skin, and pronounced features, was already widespread at the time. The Greeks themselves perceived the difference between light and dark quite differently from how we do today. White skin was by no means a beauty ideal for them. It was often associated with weakness, illness, or foreignness. Xenophon reported in his Anabasis how Greek soldiers in Anatolia encountered a people whose men and women were pale. To them, that was a sign of otherness. For the Greeks, normality was the sun, bronze skin, work in the fields, and the shine of the sea. This Mediterranean appearance distinguished them from the barbarians north of the Alps, who in their eyes seemed foreign not only linguistically, but outwardly as well. The misunderstanding that the Greeks had been blonde and fair-skinned was reinforced in the 19th century when many Western Europeans traveled through the country. Shaped by classical education, they expected descendants of Pericles and Socrates who looked like the statues in the British Museum or the Louvre. The reality shocked some travelers, dark-haired people with striking noses whose appearance reminded them more of the Orient than of the Europe they had idealized. The writer Virginia Woolf even complained at the beginning of the 20th century that the Greeks she met did not understand a word of the ancient Greek she had painstakingly learned from classical texts. This discrepancy between expectation and reality led to lasting disappointment, yet the truth lies in between. Genetic and archaeological studies show that the population of Greece has remained essentially continuous since the Bronze Age, even though outside influences were repeatedly added. The ancient Greek was therefore not a uniform ideal, but the product of many layers, the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, Indo-European immigrants from the north, and local traditions of the Mediterranean world. It is precisely this mixture that shapes the image we can still recognize today. A comparison helps us understand this ambivalence. The Romans also portrayed their gods in exalted forms, while the ordinary population looked far more everyday. Likewise, the European Renaissance idealized antiquity by viewing sculptures as pure, without knowing that they had originally been brightly painted. Misunderstandings, therefore, arise not only from missing sources, but also from projections of our own ideas. The question of the Greeks' outward appearance thus leads us directly to the deeper question of their origins. If the ideal image and reality already diverge, what about their genetic and cultural roots? Where did the Greeks originally come from, and what role did the Pelasgians, the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans play in this long process of identity formation? The history of the Greeks does not begin only with the well-known names of classical antiquity, but stretches much deeper into that time when the first cultures developed in the Aegean world. Long before Athens became a polis or Sparta sent its warriors into battle, peoples such as the Pelasgians, the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans shaped the foundation on which classical Hellas would later arise. The Pelasgians are regarded in ancient sources as a mysterious primordial population. Herodotus and Thucydides mention them as people who had already settled in Greece before the Indo-European tribes arrived. In the view of many scholars, their language was not Indo-European, but represented its own tradition lying in the darkness of prehistory. Traces can be found in ancient place names, mythical narratives, and memories of religious rites that were later absorbed into Greek mythology. Even if much remains speculative, these hints show that the Pelasgians survived as a cultural substratum and helped shape the identity of the later Greeks. The Minoan culture on Crete becomes even more clearly visible. Already in the 3rd millennium BC, the Minoans built impressive palace complexes such as Knossos or Phaistos, with frescoes, labyrinths, and elaborate architecture reflecting a highly developed society. Their script, Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day, a fascinating testimony to a language that still resists direct interpretation. For a long time, the Minoans were thought to be immigrants from Egypt or the Near East, but genetic analyses have shown that they were primarily descendants of local farmers from Anatolia and the Aegean. These findings emphasize that the Minoans were not a foreign elite, but an independent culture of the Mediterranean world that traded, developed art, and shaped religious ideas that later also left traces on the mainland. In the 2nd millennium BC, the Mycenaeans entered the stage. With their fortified citadels in Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, they embodied a new power-conscious order. Their script, Linear B, has been deciphered as the earliest form of Greek and provides valuable insights into the administration, economy, and religion of that era. The Mycenaeans adopted much from the Minoans, from artistic motifs to religious symbols, and combined it with a more militarized and hierarchical social structure. Modern genetic research confirms that the Mycenaeans were closely related to the Minoans, but at the same time exhibited additional influences from the north. While the Minoans showed almost exclusively Eastern ancestry, the Mycenaeans also incorporated the genetic heritage of steppe peoples who moved into Europe in the 3rd millennium. This northern element brought not only new linguistic influences, but probably also altered social structures. Out of this connection between Mediterranean continuity and Indo-European influx arose a culture that formed the bridge to classical antiquity. If one compares the two cultures, it becomes clear that the Minoans shone mainly through trade, art, and religion, whereas the Mycenaeans built an order oriented toward war and rule. Together they formed the foundation of the later Greek world. Out of this interaction developed an identity based not on exclusion, but on the ability to integrate influences without surrendering one's own tradition. It is remarkable that, despite migrations and political upheavals over many millennia, a clear continuity remained visible. The people of the Aegean world certainly changed through new contacts, but the foundation remained. This very pattern of absorption and fusion shapes the history of Greece right into modern times. Which brings the next decisive question into view. how did the cultures of the Bronze Age manage to form a common identity that would later enter world history as classical Hellas? At the end of the Mycenaean Age, in the 12th century BC, the world of the Aegean Sea changed fundamentally. Cities once marked by proud citadels and palaces decayed. Literary culture was lost, and an age of uncertainty began. Ancient sources speak of the Dark Ages, a period that was only later overcome through new influences. At the center stands the so-called Dorian invasion, a process that historians still debate intensely today. According to tradition, the Dorians were descendants of Heracles and claimed to migrate from the north into the Greek mainland. Archaeologically, changes can indeed be recognized. New pottery styles, different forms of weapons, and a shift in political centers of power point to upheaval. Whether this was a violent invasion, or rather a gradual migration, has never been conclusively clarified. What is certain, however, is that with the Dorians, a new tribe appeared in Greek history and changed the cultural landscape in lasting ways. The consequences of this movement were far-reaching. In the Peloponnese, the Dorians gained supremacy and founded cities such as Sparta, whose military discipline and social severity became their trademark. The Achaeans, who had previously stood at the center of power, retreated or merged with the newcomers. In this fusion, a new ethnic and cultural unity emerged, laying the foundation for classical Hellas. The end of the Mycenaean Age meant the loss of Linear B, but it also marked the beginning of a development that led to the adoption of the Phoenician script in the 8th century BC. With that, written tradition began anew, this time with an alphabet that proved far more flexible and became the basis of the entire European writing tradition. Without the rupture of the Dark Ages and the impulses brought by the Dorians, this step might not have taken place in the same way. A comparison with other regions of Europe reveals a familiar pattern. Among the Germanic peoples or the Slavs as well, it was not a homogeneous population that remained unchanged over centuries, but again and again the interaction of different groups. Identity arose not through purity, but through mixture and adaptation. That is precisely the parallel with Greece. The classical Greeks were neither pure Mycenaeans nor exclusively Dorians, but a new formation created from both currents. The cultural significance of this upheaval must not be underestimated. With the Dorians, not only did a new military tradition prevail, but a different social model as well. Sparta is the best-known example, a city in which discipline, equality among citizens, and strict training mattered more than wealth or artistic development. In contrast, Athens, which remained more strongly shaped by Ionian influences, developed into a center of democracy, philosophy, and art. It was precisely this contrast between Dorian severity and Ionian openness that gave Greece its tension and diversity. The transition from the Bronze Age into the Classical period was therefore not a simple sequence, but a process of profound transformations. Old structures collapsed, new forces emerged, and within this field of tension Hellas took shape, the Hellas that would later be regarded as the cradle of Europe. But the story does not end there. After the Dorians and the establishment of classical cultures, the next great question arose. How did external influences, above all the migrations from the north and east, affect the Greeks? And what role did the Slavs in particular play in the long history of the population of the Balkans? After the end of antiquity and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Balkans entered an age of upheaval that we know as the Migration period. Between the 4th and 7th centuries, Goths, Huns, Avars, and finally Slavs successively moved into the region. For Greece, this meant an enormous challenge, because many areas had been depopulated by wars, epidemics, and economic crises. The Slavs, who appeared south of the Balkans in large numbers in the 6th and 7th centuries, therefore found room in which they could settle permanently. Contemporary sources describe these events in dramatic terms. The church historian John of Ephesus reported that in the years 577 to 578 AD, Around 100,000 Slavs invaded Hellas, devastated the land, and took possession of it. Soon afterward, they even besieged Constantinople. Other regions, especially parts of the Peloponnese, northern Greece, and Thessaly, were settled by Slavic groups that founded new villages and developed their own structures. The consequences were profound. In some areas, the Slavs became so dominant that even the language changed. Byzantine chroniclers complained that in villages of the Peloponnese one could barely hear Greek anymore. In the 19th century, the German historian Jakob Philipp Feuermeyer took up exactly this point when he formulated the provocative thesis that modern Greeks were basically Hellenized Slavs. His words caused a storm of indignation because they called into question the romantic image of unbroken continuity from antiquity to modern times. Yet, as so often, the truth lies in the middle. Without a doubt, many Slavs settled in Greece, and they left traces in place names, customs, and also in genetic patterns. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire was strong enough not only to tolerate these new inhabitants, but to integrate them into its order. The decisive step was Christianization. Through baptism and incorporation into the Orthodox Church, Slavs were transformed from foreigners into participants in the empire. Emperors such as Basil and Leo VI boasted not only of having defeated entire Slavic tribes militarily, but also of having won them culturally. This process of Hellenization did not happen overnight, but over centuries. Language, religion, and political loyalty became the measure of belonging. Whoever spoke Greek, recognized the emperor, and followed the Orthodox faith was considered a Roman, regardless of ethnic origin. In this way, a pattern we already know from antiquity repeated itself. Greek identity was never static, but always the result of adaptation and integration. A look at Western Europe reveals interesting parallels. While in the West the Germanic peoples took over the collapsing Roman Empire and in the process became Romanized, something similar happened in the East with the Slavs. They rejuvenated an aging Byzantium, adopted elements of its culture, and thereby became carriers of Orthodox civilization. This also explains why the South Slavic peoples later became close cultural relatives of the Greeks. Still, traces of the Slavic element remain visible. Numerous place names in the Peloponnese, such as Andravida or Vastitsa, go back to Slavic roots. Folk songs and customs also recall that period. Genetic analyses show that modern Greeks do carry a Slavic component, but it does not dominate. Rather, it forms part of a larger mosaic that also includes Pelasgian, Mycenaean, Anatolian, and other influences. The migration period, with its Slavic settlements, was therefore not an erasure, but a transformation. Greece survived because it was able to absorb new groups and offer them a common roof, the roof of Byzantium. After the upheavals of the migration period, in which Slavs, Huns, and other groups swept across the Balkans, a new chapter began for the Greeks. With the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we later know as Byzantium, they received a political and cultural homeland that would shape their identity for centuries. Here the self-designation Romaioi arose, Romans, but in a sense that extended far beyond the ancient capital on the Tiber. Those who called themselves Romoi understood themselves as heirs of the Roman Empire even if their language was Greek and their spiritual center lay in Constantinople. This name expressed continuity. One was not a small people on the edge of Europe, but part of a universal order that claimed to be the true Rome. At the same time, a new religious identity resonated within the term Romoi, for Christianity formed the unshakable core of this self-understanding. Whoever belonged to the Orthodox Church, whoever heard the liturgy in Greek, and whoever recognized the emperor as both worldly and divinely legitimated ruler, was considered part of this community, regardless of whether his ancestors were of Slavic, Armenian, or Syrian origin. This model was unique. While in the West Germanic kingdoms arose that often based their power on tribal affiliation, Byzantium defined itself above all through religion and loyalty to the empire. In this way, it created a flexible identity that made it possible to integrate different peoples without endangering unity. It is precisely this openness that explains why Byzantium endured for more than 1,000 years. A vivid example of the strength of this model is the integration of the Slavs. In the 6th and 7th centuries, they were still viewed as foreigners, but over time, through baptism and Hellenization, they became equal members of the empire. Something similar happened with Armenians, who produced important generals, or Syrians, who left a strong mark as theologians and monks. Thus there grew a multi-ethnic, yet nevertheless common identity concentrated in the term Romoi. Orthodoxy was more than mere religion. It was the cultural backbone. Icon painting, church music, and the Byzantine liturgy became visible signs of a world that clearly distinguished itself from the West. While Rome and later the Catholic Church spoke Latin, Byzantium held fast to Greek, not as a mere dialect, but as the language of Holy Scripture, philosophy, and administration. In that way, the connection to the ancient tradition remained alive, even though it was clothed in a new Christian garment. This balancing act between antiquity and Christianity, between Roman heritage and Greek culture, made the self-understanding of the Romoi so special. In songs, chronicles, and everyday usage, this name survived into modern times. Even in the 19th century, many Greeks still spoke of Romeosini in order to describe their identity, a term that meant not only nation, but also faith and an entire way of life. Compared with other peoples of Europe, a clear difference emerges. Germans, Frenchmen, or Englishmen developed their identity mainly through language, territory, and ruling dynasties. The Greeks, by contrast, as Romoi, defined themselves primarily through their belonging to a spiritual and religious order. That also explains why, despite foreign rule, whether by Slavs, Franks, or Ottomans, they never completely lost their self-understanding. At exactly this point, it becomes clear that the Byzantine experience forms the link between antiquity and modernity. Without the concept of the Romoi, it would hardly have been conceivable that the Greeks could preserve their cultural continuity for more than 1,000 years. When Constantinople fell in 1453, an age began for the Greeks that would shape their face for centuries. With the conquest by the Ottomans, they entered a new political order that on the one hand meant oppression, but on the other hand also brought forth new forms of coexistence. For almost 400 years, the Greeks lived as a Christian minority in the Ottoman Empire, an experience that left deep traces in culture, daily life, and identity. Ottoman rule brought with it a clear social hierarchy. At the top stood the Muslims, while Christians and Jews, as dhimmis, were protected peoples, but had to pay special taxes and were disadvantaged in many areas. Nevertheless, the Greeks formed an important layer within the empire as merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and scholars. The Phanariates in Constantinople in particular, a Greek elite of diplomats and officials, played a central role in the administration. This double experience of subordination and importance shaped the Greeks' self-understanding in lasting ways. In the Balkans, this period saw intensive mixing. Turks settled in the cities. Albanians moved into Greek regions and often took on military or agricultural tasks. Many Greek families lived side by side with people of different origins, leaving traces not only in everyday life, but also in genetics. Analyses show that haplogroups typical of the Ottoman sphere can also be found among Greeks, signs that mixing took place over the centuries. Yet the Ottoman period was not only a phase of genetic penetration, but also of cultural interaction. Numerous elements of Greek everyday life today come from this era: music with its oriental scales, foods such as baklava or moussaka, and even words in modern Greek of Turkish origin. These influences make it clear that identity is not rigid, but is formed in long processes of exchange and adaptation. A comparison with other regions of Europe reveals parallels. In Spain, the Moors left clear traces in architecture, language, and cuisine over centuries, without Spain thereby losing its distinctiveness. It was similar in Greece. Despite Ottoman influence, awareness of one's own culture remained alive, above all through the Orthodox Church, which functioned as the guardian of language, education, and religion. Particularly interesting is the role of the Albanians in this period. Many of them migrated southward, settled in Attica, the Peloponnese or Euboea, and merged with the Greek population. Even today there are villages in which Arvanitika, an Albanian dialect, was spoken long before it gradually disappeared in the 20th century. These Albanian elements flowed not only into language, but also into customs and clothing, making the image of the Greeks ever more multifaceted. The Turks themselves posed a special challenge. On the one hand, they were the rulers. On the other hand, personal ties repeatedly arose. In border regions, mixed communities came into being, and not a few Greeks converted to Islam in order to gain social advantages. At the same time, many held fast to their faith and saw in it precisely the core of their identity. In this way, a kind of culture of resistance developed in which religion became the symbol of survival. Despite all foreign rule, an astonishing continuity can be seen in this period as well. The Greeks continued to understand themselves as Romoi, as heirs of the Byzantine Empire, even though political circumstances had made them subjects of the Sultan. This double identity, on the one hand part of the Ottoman Empire, on the other hand carriers of their own tradition, explains why Greece in the 19th century was seized so strongly by the idea of national rebirth. At the beginning of the 19th century, Greece was still under Ottoman rule. Villages and cities were marked by centuries of foreign influence. The Orthodox Church kept alive the memory of language and faith. But political destiny lay firmly in the hands of the Sultan. It was precisely in this situation that educated Europe rediscovered Hellas, not as it existed in everyday reality, but in the transfigured form of antiquity. Poets, painters, and scholars spoke of the cradle of civilization. Out of this enthusiasm grew a movement we know as Philhellenism. Philhellenism was more than just a literary current. It was the expression of a romantic longing not merely to study antiquity, but to experience it. In Weimar, Goethe raved about Greek art. In Paris, archaeologists compared newly discovered statues with divine beauty. And in England, young aristocrats traveled on the grand tour to Athens in order to see the Acropolis with their own eyes. Yet the reality disappointed many. The people they encountered there differed outwardly and culturally from the idealized images in their textbooks. It was precisely this contrast that strengthened the idea that the true Greeks had to be liberated and restored to their ancient greatness. When the Greek War of Independence broke out in 1821, Europe reacted with a mixture of enthusiasm and political skepticism. The great powers, Britain, France, and Russia, hesitated at first because they feared that revolutions might endanger the European balance. But the voices of the Philhellenes grew louder. Poets such as Lord Byron traveled to Greece themselves, took part in the struggle, and even gave their lives for the cause. His presence in Missolonghi made him the symbol of a Europe that did not want to stand by idly. The effect of this movement was enormous. While Greeks fought Ottoman troops on the battlefields, a wave of solidarity unfolded in the salons of Europe. Donations were collected, newspapers reported heroic deeds, and painters such as Eugène Delacroix captured the struggle for freedom in powerful images. This interaction of romantic enthusiasm and realpolitik pressure ultimately led to decisive intervention. In 1827, British, French, and Russian fleets destroyed the Ottoman Armada in the Battle of Navarino. This victory opened the way to the creation of an independent Greek state in 1830. If one compares this development with other liberation movements of the 19th century, a remarkable difference becomes visible. While in Italy or Germany national unification and internal forces played the decisive role, Greek independence would hardly have been conceivable without foreign support. Philhellenism gave the Greeks a special place in the hearts of Europeans, not because they were contemporary, powerful, or wealthy, but because they were seen as the living bridge to antiquity. This romantic view, however, also had its shadow side. Many Europeans expected the Greeks, after their liberation, to behave as one would hope from the descendants of Plato and Aristotle. The reality was more complicated. A young country marked by poverty, internal conflicts, and regional differences first had to find itself. Still, the fact remains that, without the enthusiasm of the Philhellenes, the dream of independence would probably not have become reality so quickly. Hardly anything shapes the consciousness of a people as strongly as language. For the Greeks, it was not only a means of communication, but the actual bearer of identity. From the first scripts of the Bronze Age to the modern official language, a red thread ran through history that was never completely broken, even in times of foreign domination and migration. Already in the second millennium BC, the Mycenaeans used Linear B, which is regarded as the earliest written form of Greek. On clay tablets found in palaces such as Knossos or Pylos, lists of goods, sacrificial offerings, and administrative records can be deciphered. Thanks to this, we know today that the language of the Mycenaeans already had an Indo-European root that extends into modern Greek. After the collapse of Mycenaean culture, this writing system was lost, and the so-called Dark Ages left behind a gap without writing. In the 8th century BC came the decisive turning point. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet and added vowels, a revolutionary innovation that laid the foundation for almost all later European scripts. From then on, it was possible not only to keep administrative lists, but also to record poetry, philosophy, and science. The Iliad and the Odyssey became monuments of a language that conveyed more than mere words. They embodied an entire worldview. The diversity of dialects nevertheless remained. Ionic, Doric, and others all reflected regional differences. But with the rise of Athens in the 5th century BC, the Attic dialect prevailed. From it emerged the so-called Koine, a common language that spread across the entire eastern Mediterranean. It was this Koine in which the New Testament was written, an indication of how greatly Greek had become a language of religion and culture even outside Hellas. After the division of the Roman Empire, Greek remained the language of the East. Byzantium cultivated a highly literary form that was strongly oriented toward classical models, while spoken Greek continued to develop in everyday life. This contrast between high language and popular language accompanied the Greeks for centuries. With the founding of the modern Greek state in 1830, the so-called language question broke out openly. Katharousa, an artificially purified form strongly modeled on ancient Greek, was elevated to the official language, while Demotic, the everyday language spoken by millions, was officially devalued. For generations, this led to tensions in education and society. Only in 1976 did Parliament decide to declare Demotic the sole official language. This step was more than a language reform. It symbolized the recognition that identity lies not in artificial purity, but in lived reality. Many elements of Katharousa nevertheless remained in vocabulary, grammar, and the liturgy of the Church. In this way, tradition and everyday life merged into a synthesis that makes modern Greek unique. A comparison shows the particularity of this path. While Italy, after its unification in the 19th century, defined Florentine as the standard, and France early on fixed Paris as its linguistic center, Greece remained torn between two poles, the legacy of antiquity and the reality of modernity. That in the end the language of the people prevailed underlines the power of an identity nourished by life itself. Today, Greek is a language with around 13 million speakers. Yet its cultural weight far exceeds that number. It carries myths and texts that became the foundation of European intellectual history, and it remains the bond that connects Greeks all over the world. At the beginning of the 21st century, the question of Greek identity presents itself once again with special sharpness. Millennia of migrations, conquests, and cultural encounters have left traces, and yet a strong feeling of continuity still exists. Who then are the Greeks today beyond the romantic images of antiquity and the political myths of the 19th century? Modern genetics has provided astonishing insights in recent decades. Studies show that the population of Greece has remained remarkably stable since the Bronze Age. The Minoans and Mycenaeans, whose genes continue in part among modern Greeks, still form the foundation. Later came influences from Slavic groups in the early Middle Ages, from Albanians in the Ottoman era, and also Turkish elements during the centuries of foreign rule. Haplogroups such as EV13, R1b, R1a, and J2 appear in varying proportions and show both kinship with Balkan peoples such as Albanians and South Slavs and, at the same time, a clear distinctiveness. The result is not a break in the line, but a mosaic reflecting a long history. The comparison with other European nations is instructive. Germany and France as well consist genetically of mixtures of Celts, Germanic peoples, Romans, and many other groups. Yet no one feels any less German or any less French because of that. It is similar in Greece. Genetic diversity does not diminish identity. Rather, it underlines its capacity for integration. Alongside genetics, the diaspora plays a decisive role. Since the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Greeks emigrated to North America, Australia, or European metropolises such as London and Munich. There they founded communities, built churches, and kept their language alive. In New York, for example, Astoria became a center of Greek life, while Melbourne today has one of the largest Greek communities outside Greece. This diaspora contributes to the fact that Greek identity is no longer limited to the territory of Greece, but remains globally networked. At the same time, the experiences of modernity have raised the question of belonging in a new way. The financial crisis of 2010 caused old prejudices to flare up again, and many Europeans debated whether Greece truly belonged to Europe. Yet it was precisely in this moment that identity proved to be more than economic statistics. For the Greeks themselves, it was a time in which they once again reflected on language, culture, and their orthodox tradition, those constants that have outlasted all foreign influences. A glance at the Urums in the Caucasus, or the Kalasha in present-day Pakistan, shows how far Greek influence reached and how differently it was interpreted. The Urums speak a Turkic language, yet still feel themselves to be Greeks because their customs, their cuisine, and their Orthodox faith connect them with Hellas. The Kalasha, for their part, preserve polytheistic elements that they interpret as a legacy of Alexander the Great, even though scholars view this claim critically. Both examples show that being Greek does not mean possessing genetic purity, but being part of a cultural inheritance that is reshaped from generation to generation. Today, the Greeks understand themselves as a modern European people, rooted in a long history. They are neither only descendants of antiquity, nor exclusively children of Byzantium or the Ottoman Empire. They are all of these things at once, a living synthesis existing in the tension between tradition and modernity. And so the circle of our journey closes, from the Pelagians and Mycenaeans to the present day, from mythical ancestors through the Byzantine Romoi to a nation that asserts its identity in global dialogue. The long journey through the history of the Greeks shows us that identity is never something rigid. From the mysterious Pelagians and the palaces of the Minoans, through the struggles of the Mycenaeans and the arrival of the Dorians, from the Slavs and Byzantines to the Ottomans and the rebirth of the 19th century, new layers were added again and again without the core being completely lost. To be Greek never meant descent alone, but always also language, religion, tradition, and the ability to turn change into continuity. That is exactly where the secret lies. To this day, the Greeks are a living mosaic that shows how diversity can become strength. And perhaps in this story we also recognize a part of our own. For the question of who we are is not one that concerns only the Greeks. We too, in Germany, in Europe, in a globalized world, struggle with belonging, with roots, and with the future. The example of Greece reminds